Thanks, Karen. I also want to thank Paul Shea, everybody at the Yellowstone Gateway Museum, and to thank all of you people for turning out tonight. This is an excellent turnout. I'm really happy about that and humbled with all the people here. I see there's no avenue of escape. So when I first moved to Bozeman back in 1974, one of the things I noticed was the name Story, placed in a lot of places. Story Street, Story Hills, Story Motor Supply, Story this, Story that. And it's kind of like from the motion picture Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid when they were being chased by the posse. And they kept looking out at the posse following them saying, who are those guys? Well, I kind of had the same thing with Nelson Story. Who was that guy? You know, what made him so prominent? And so I began the research actually back in the 1990s as kind of a hobby and stayed with it and was able to finish it and to complete this book. I can say that Nelson Story was an important figure not only in the growth and development of Bozeman, but also in this stretch of the territory, and for that matter, for the entire state as well. He was a real, as his grandson Malcolm said, he was a real operator. He was indeed. He was a real piece of work. If you look at, be it the actual Western milieu or genre, or if you look at the mythical aspect of it, some of the people that have always been, at least when we were kids, our heroes is, the guys that rode with the posse, or, to track down the robbers and what have you, the road agents, Indian fighters, grew up with all of that. The cattlemen, they were, well documented in all kinds of TV and television shows. The businessman, even the banker. Nelson Story delved in all of those. He was a Western capitalist. He was one of those who diversified enough and had enough of an economic impact that he actually helped sustain the community of Bozeman in its early years. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. In many ways, he was to Montana what Leland Stanford is to California. Probably recognize the name Stanford University. Leland Stanford, during the gold rush out there, he started out as a merchant. Eventually, with all his money, invested in railroads and other areas. John Eliff started in Pikes Peak Gold Rush, Colorado, as a merchant. Eventually became a major cattle king in northern Colorado. John Creighton, from Nebraska, another name that probably rings a bell. He got his grub stake in Alder Gulch, just like Nelson Story did. And with that, he went back to Nebraska and, again, branched off into various different interests. So these are examples of the Western capitalists. There are also others in Montana. Thomas Power, who was up in Fort Benton, he and his brother as well, the Conrad brothers, you could make that argument. But closer to home for us, it's Nelson Story. He's from Ohio, born in 1838, and in the late 1850s, as America was moving towards the Civil War, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed by Congress. And basically what it said, the controversy over whether or not Kansas was going to be a free state or a slave state, they were going to leave it up to the people there. That helped to draw him at the age of 20 from Ohio, Meigs County, Ohio, to Kansas. They also said that there was plenty of land available, so he thought he could go out there. With everybody else moving in, there would certainly be a lot of jobs, a lot of opportunity to make some money. And he was right. Didn't quite turn out as nice as he wanted. He started out initially, building fences breaking sod, clearing brush for various landowners. But he worked his way up to where he was able to work as a teamster. And in the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, he made several trips between Fort Leavenworth and what is now Denver, the Pikes Peak Gold Rush. So that was one of his first breaks there. While he was in Kansas, he met one Ellen Trent, a native of Missouri. Her ancestry, her family, goes back to Kentucky and back to Virginia. Couldn't tell if she was part of the pro-slavery element that moved into Missouri. Don't know that. There's no evidence that the Trent family ever owned any slaves. But Nelson Story was an ardent Republican and an ardent abolitionist. Still, he meets Ellen Trent. They get married. After all this time in Kansas, bleeding Kansas, as historians would call it, with all the killings and fighting. It was the prelude, actually, to the Civil War, a pretty dangerous place to live in. They relocated, he and Ellen, to Denver and he set up a mercantile operation in Denver. In the meantime, they were there just a couple of months in 1862 when word filtered out that further to the north in Idaho Territory, at a place called Grasshopper Creek, some other people, some other miners, hit some pay dirt. You got to remember that in the wake of the California Gold Rush and the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, those who did not have much success in either one of those areas, they fanned out all over the Rocky Mountain West to try and find, they wanted to make it worth the trip, if they struck out at Pikes Peak or in California. In effect, that's how Nevada, Virginia City, Nevada, got going. That's why it was founded so early when you compare it to other places in the West. But the strike up on Grasshopper Creek attracted Nelson and Ellen. Nelson more than Ellen. I think she was kind of tired already of moving around a little bit. They established a community, the miners did. They called it Bannock. And so the Storys in the spring of 1863, by wagon train, came up to Bannock. And they got to Bannock, and there was hardly anybody there. Kind of looked like a ghost town already. Ellen looked at her husband and said, "We've been on the road for months for this. This is what you brought me to?" Well, he went to find out what happened. What had happened in the interim is some other miners had hit some pay dirt, really good payoff, in Alder Gulch along Alder Creek. And they tried to keep it a secret. They kind of stumbled upon it by accident. Panning for gold and having success there. They decided they'd go back to Bannock and get some supplies and come back, but don't tell anybody. Excuse me. Miners can't keep secrets. And for that matter, when people in Bannock noticed these guys were using fresh gold dust to buy things, when they left town to head back to Alder Gulch, they had about 200 miners following them. So they had a meeting at Beaverhead Rock, and they said, "Okay, here's the deal. Yeah, we found gold at this place with a lot of alder bushes around it. We'll show you where it is, but we get to make our claims first." Deal was made, no problem. Hence, we get Alder Gulch, Virginia City. We eventually also get Nevada City, other little communities. Once Nelson Story found out what the deal was, he and Ellen also went to Alder Gulch. She may have been, well, she was one of the very first white women to live in Alder Gulch. Their first home was a canvas tent along Alder Creek. Story spent time there. They eventually moved up to Summit when that community was created, and he had pretty good luck mining for gold with some partners. Another aspect of Virginia City that involved Story was the vigilantes, the road agents. When that movement started, Nelson Story, and nobody has contradicted it or challenged it, Nelson Story claimed to have been one of the two guys who kicked the box, pulled the box out from underneath the feet of George Ives while he was standing there with a noose around his neck and his hands tied. He was the first victim of the vigilantes, and it was Nelson Story was one of the people who sent him to the promised land. And he rode with the vigilantes also for several months off and on, but he was more interested in business. And at the time that Virginia City, about 1864 or so, I don't want to get into too much detail, but there were some people that came up here and realized that they could make pretty good money setting up farms and ranches to grow foodstuffs to feed to the miners. One of those who saw that was John Bozeman. He decided, when he learned about an old Indian trail that went through the Bighorn Basin on the east side of the Bighorn Mountains, he decided, hey, we could get people to come off the Oregon Trail. I could charge them money, bring them up that way, and bring them into the Gallatin Valley, and then if they wanted, they could go on to Virginia City. Last Chance Gulch had just started. They could go to Last Chance Gulch. Prior to the Bozeman Trail, is what it became. But prior to that, if you wanted to get to Montana, you would follow the Oregon Trail to Fort Hall, which is at present-day Pocatello. Turn north, basically where I-15 is, and follow that and go in over Monida Pass or Bannock Pass. That's what the Stories did. John Bozeman set up this trail, and in doing that, he and a few others laid out a town site that became the town of Bozeman, an agricultural center. Nelson Story, obviously aware of that, decided that would be a good place to have a family, start a family, as opposed to a rough and tumble gold mining camp. The population of Virginia City was starting to wane anyway, as you had more gold discovered up in Last Chance Gulch. So Story decided he's going to start a mercantile operation in this new little community of Bozeman. And in 1865, at the conclusion of the Civil War, he finds out about another really nice economic opportunity down in Texas. During the Civil War, the population of longhorn steers just took off. There were no men there to regulate the herds, run the herds, manage the herds. They were off fighting for the bars and stars. But the war is over. You had all this cattle for the taking in Texas. You could get a steer, a longhorn steer in Texas at this time for anywhere from $5 to $10 a head. You get it to one of the forts on the western perimeter, Army forts, you could get $20 a head. If you got it to Chicago, now that the markets were reopened after the war, if you got it to Chicago, $40 a head. So you can see how profitable it was, and you can see how the cattle drive era, the Dodge cities, all that kind of good thing, how that came about. And Nelson Story took his gold earnings. He had about $30,000 in gold dust. He must have been very determined because at the time he left, Ellen was pregnant with their first child, and she's like 2 or 3 months away from giving birth. Fortunately, Nelson's brother was also in the Gulch, so he kind of took care of her while Nelson was gone. He made arrangements to have his gold cashed in for greenbacks. The greenbacks were the specie. Well, they were the money used during the Civil War, but they were not backed up by any specie. Therefore, the exchange rate, he had $30,000 worth of gold. He got about $40,000 in cash just by making the trip. He made $10,000, which in those days was pretty serious money. Made his way to Texas with a couple of friends, bought a herd of longhorns, somewhere between $5 and $10 a head. His intention, some articles, some books suggest that initially he was going to go to the railhead in Missouri, at Sedalia, Missouri, load the cattle there, send them up to Chicago, make a nice little profit, and then go back home to Montana. In all the documents I went through of the Story family and the books of history written close to that time, there's no mention. It appears that Nelson Story intended all along to bring a herd of longhorns up into Montana into the Yellowstone Valley. And another situation that you run into is if you see, this is what he's really known for in the annals of the American West. In some books on the American West, you won't find anything about Nelson's story except his 1866 cattle drive. Same with articles that'll be in historic magazines. Some articles say he started with, say he had 600 head. Some say he had 300 head. Some say he had 1,000 head. Some say he had 3,000 head. If you see anything that claims 300 head or 3,000 head, don't buy it. So that leaves 600 or 1,000. So which one was it? Here's a politician's answer for you. Both. He started out with 600 head when he left Fort Worth. When he got to Baxter Springs, Kansas Jayhawkers had set up a roadblock. It was more of an intimidating type thing. They claimed Texas steers were bringing in tick fever to their cattle herds. So if you wanted to proceed, we might let you proceed, but it's going to cost you a lot of money. Well, there was a big backup of cattle. Some cattlemen didn't want to defy them. Some who did were killed. Nelson Story decided, well, I'm not going to turn back. He decided he was going to take them west and go around the blockade. But before he left, he acquired about 400 to 500 more head, either buying them or getting them at, as they say, at a five-finger discount, just kind of pilfering them. That's what he did. Went around, made it to Fort Leavenworth, bought repeating rifles at Fort Leavenworth because he knew what was waiting for him on what had become the Bloody Bozeman, the Bozeman Trail. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, their hunting grounds, they waged warfare all along the Bozeman Trail. You probably have a pretty good idea about that. He bought repeating rifles, made his way to Fort Laramie, turned the herd north, had several run-ins with Indians on the way through present-day Wyoming, did lose some men, but he made it all the way to Fort Phil Kearny, where the commander, one Colonel Carrington, says, you don't have enough men in your train to proceed. The Bozeman Trail's dangerous. You're going to have to wait here until more people come up the trail. Then we'll let you go. This was September. And Story said, well, you got to understand something. We just did most of the Bozeman Trail. So what good is it? Carrington wouldn't let him move. He had the army to back him up. So they waited about a week or two, and then one of his men was killed in an ambush by Indians, and Story said, that's enough. We're not going to hang around here. Nobody else was coming up the trail. He went to Carrington and said, why can't we go? Carrington said, because, for the same reason, you got to stay here. So Story came back, talked to his men, and said, we can either stay here and most likely lose the herd to winter snows, or the Army's going to confiscate it, or we can sneak out of here and get these up into the Yellowstone Valley. If he didn't get them to the Yellowstone Valley, as he told his men, he said there'd be no paychecks. So they took a vote. Everybody except one guy voted to sneak out. The one guy who didn't is George Dow. And Nelson Story being Nelson Story, he immediately ordered George Dow bound, gagged, tied up, and tossed into the back of a wagon so he wouldn't spill the beans to the Army. At night, with a full moon, they managed to sneak out of there. To me, it's amazing they did. And by the time the Army knew they were gone, they were 10 miles up the trail. It worked. He made it. They completed the cattle drive, and he established his cow camp about a mile from here, right along the Shields River. Crow land, it was not the Crow Reservation yet, but Crow land extended down to the Wind River in Wyoming, all the way up to the Muscle Shell, and the western boundary followed the Yellowstone River. Story put his cow camp as close as humanly possible because he could run his cattle. Who was going to catch him? He could run his cattle there. He could run it along the Shields River. So his cow camp was built there. It was ideally located. His husband is true because it makes good theater, you know. Keep in mind, John Bozeman, he was handsome in the young community of Bozeman, and he was from Georgia. In the young community, if you had a wife, a daughter, or a girlfriend, you didn't like him. It was a pro-union, pro-Republican town. Again, he's a Southern Democrat. Another strike against him. Union veterans, as they came out, he was a Southerner. They didn't like him. Confederate veterans, when they made their way to Montana after the war, they didn't like him because he wasn't serving the Stars and Bars during the Civil War. Or as a lady from North Carolina politely told me, the war of northern aggression. He wasn't there. So somewhere in all of that mix, we think he had a friend or two, but who knows. In the wake of his death, the people in the Gallatin Valley clamored to Uncle Sam for protection. The Bozeman Trail forts were being closed in the wake of Red Cloud's war. They wanted protection for the Gallatin Valley. Now, the Gallatin Valley every now and then was subjected to raids by Sioux war parties, but for the most part in the Gallatin Valley you were safe. You came over the Bozeman Pass back then and went through the Yellowstone Valley through here, yeah, you were taking your life into your hands. The government agreed to establish a fort, and because they did want the flow of gold to continue coming out of this territory to rebuild the treasury. And so Fort Ellis is built near Bozeman. It was called the fort that saved Bozeman. Not so much from Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, it saved Bozeman economically. Here was an immediate source for farmers and ranchers to sell horses, to sell cattle, to sell grain, hay to the U.S. Army. And then quickly in the community of Bozeman, you had a huge growth of saloons and hotels for single girls. Okay, everybody gets that one. All right. Nelson's Story, kind of in the right place at the right time, profiting even more because of that growth. As the forts closed down, Story, because he had wagons left over from the cattle drive, took his wagons down to Fort C.F. Smith on the Bighorn and bought a lot of equipment from the Army. The Army was moving out. They wanted to get rid of stuff. They sold nails. They sold plows. They sold what are known as Dutch ovens. You name it, you could buy it. All kinds of hardware. The Dutch ovens, for example, Nelson's Story paid $1 a piece for them. He loads up his wagons. He brings them back to Bozeman. Then he goes up to Helena to sell them. The Dutch ovens, he gets $100 a piece for. That made it worth the trip. He had enough men, enough wagons going through the Yellowstone Valley. He wasn't worried about the Indians. That's just one example. The soldiers at the fort used to call guys like Story Commodore when they would come, you know, and wheel and deal. But when they found out how much profit he was making, they suddenly referred to him as that old pirate. Leander Black also moved to Bozeman, and Leander Black and Nelson's Story together got involved with another, let's call it cash cow for the Gallatin Valley, and that would be the Crow Reservation once it was firmly established. And as you know, the first agency was not too far from here. Story and Black were among those who got the early contracts to the reservation to supply beef. No problem for Nelson's Story. He could buy wheat, potatoes from Gallatin Valley farmers, turn around at a profit, sell them to the agency, in effect to the United States government, and he did that. In so doing, a lot of times, because he was in cahoots with the agent, he was able to get paid for goods he didn't deliver. There were times when he and the agent, after he had delivered goods and been paid, he and the agent might take those same goods and then sell them in Bozeman. He had a cattle, his cattle herd was over here, obviously, and when he would deliver cattle They would count the cattle, obviously, for payment. He would have his herders put agency cattle in with his. So he was basically getting paid for cattle they already owned. He couldn't have gotten away with it without the agent's complicity. And that's what happens. That speaks to the entire reservation system and the corruption that prevailed in the 19th century. Why it is that on many reservations, Indians were abused, were neglected, and many of them even starved. And it wasn't just here. He was doing what was common practice back then. Keep in mind, you're out here in Montana Territory. The long arm of the law is a long way away. So anyhow, government contracts with the Crow Reservation. He also, along with Black, started a bank in Bozeman. And he also began to promote and hope, like everybody else did, that the railroad, Northern Pacific Railroad, would make its way to Bozeman. Well, the railroad was stalled at Bismarck, North Dakota, because of the panic of 1874. Jay Cook just ran out of money. He couldn't move any further. So Nelson was one of those who financed expeditions like the Wagon Road and Prospecting Expedition of 1874. A bunch of men from Bozeman came down into the Yellowstone Valley to pick fights with the Sioux, believing the Army would come to the rescue and the Army would establish forts in the Yellowstone Valley and roads and everything would be good. Hallelujah, we could get our stuff back east, ship our goods back east. The Army wouldn't have anything to do with it. They even had a battle with the Sioux near Little Bighorn River. And before all that happened, one Army officer who found out about this expedition thought it was ridiculous, shouldn't be there, it's going to cause all kinds of trouble. That officer was Lieutenant Colonel George Custer. We all know what happened to him later, but Nelson Story was one of the financiers behind that. Rough and tumble town was Bozeman. It's the same for all communities at this particular time in the 1870s. The Indian Wars were going on. Eventually, the agency was relocated from Mission Creek on down to near present-day Columbus, relocating the reservation. There were constantly running fights with the Sioux Indians. Story and Black had a falling out. Two guys like that, overly ambitious business guys, you got to figure their partnership wouldn't last long, and it didn't. Leander Black down the road eventually lost just about all of his money and died relatively young. But through the 1870s, Story continued his dealings with the Crow Reservation. The government finally caught up with them. And they had a grand jury called in Bozeman to investigate charges of fraud and deceit by Nelson Story and Dexter Clapp, who was the agent. So the jury assembled in Bozeman, and after listening to testimony for a few days, the federal prosecutor, a guy named Merritt Page, who most likely might have been in on getting a few kickbacks, he suddenly says, this is a farce, the allegations made here are wrong, judge, dismiss this jury. And for some reason the judge did. That stopped it. Nelson Story bragged he had to pay $10,000 to bribe that jury. They had another grand jury assembly a year later over in Virginia City. They said there was not enough evidence to indict him. So he continued on from there. 1883, he had kind of phased out of the Indian agency business, selling supplies to the agency. He had moved out of that, and now he was into flour milling. He got the equipment for the first major flour mill in Bozeman when he foreclosed on a guy who he lent money to buy it in the first place. And this guy had a tough time, and so Story just foreclosed, took the equipment, and started his own operation, which became very successful and very important in early Bozeman. The railroad finally edges its way through. Voila, along comes Livingston. Before that, obviously, Billings and so many other communities along the Yellowstone River. To celebrate this great opening of the railroad, it's arranged a couple of months after the railroad gets to Bozeman. They're going to bring out a couple of trains of very special celebrities, journalists, politicians, investors to attend the Golden Spike ceremony that would be held up by Gold Creek near Helena. And among those in the train of celebrities was Ulysses S. Grant, the first ex-president to visit Montana. They stop in Bozeman. Now, again, during the Grant administration, his administration was seriously rocked by scandal, by the corruption, the thievery that was going on with the Indian agency system. His own Secretary of the War was impeached over it. And the Secretary of War's wife was one of those doling out traitorships in exchange for kickbacks. So it was a mess. Grant himself really didn't have anything to do with it. But they get to Bozeman, they stop, Grant and all these others get off the train, and Grant wants to take a tour of Bozeman. So, guess who gets the honor? Nelson Story, because he had about the best coach in town. The irony of it just really hit me. Here's a president whose administration was horribly rocked by the scandals involving Indian agencies, taking a tour of a town built heavily on those profits, being escorted by the lead profiteer himself. I guess only in the West. Well, real quickly, a realtor named Tom Qua built a side spur on the railroad out in the middle of the valley. Didn't know what to call it. When he found out Jay Cook had recruited investors from Serbia to invest in the railroad from Eastern Europe, Qua decided to honor them and impress them by naming it Belgrade. That's how we got the name Belgrade. Just another one of those, nebulous facts you can spring on somebody at your next cocktail party. Or what they ask you, who was the first ex-president ever to visit? Nobody's going to ask you. A couple of years later, Montana is moving towards statehood. And the legislature, for some reason, decides to let the people, in those days guys, vote as to where the capital would be. Territorial capital was in Helena. It's kind of a goofy thing, you'd think. Well, several communities threw their hat in the ring. Butte wanted it. Anaconda. The Copper Kings got in a big fight over that. You probably read about that. Anaconda got into it. Boulder even put its name in to be capital, as did Bozeman. And Bozeman launched a really, really huge publicity campaign. Bozeman was very confident it was going to become the state capital because, among some of the things they bragged about, was Bozeman, the Gallatin Valley, has the bluest skies, the greenest grass, the best picket fences, the prettiest girls, and the healthiest babies. Where else are you going to put the state capital? Well, as we all know, after wheeling and dealing and graft and bribes, so forth and so on, it did go to Helena. Nelson Story was one of those who promoted Bozeman to be the capital. He worked tirelessly on that. Bozeman didn't get it. As a consolation prize, it got the College of Mechanic and Agriculture Arts, which, as you know, today is MSU. Story put up some money to help effect that, and he donated some land to help close the deal. But in Bozeman's belief they were going to become the state capital, that's why the Bozeman Hotel was built. South 8th Avenue, the fancy big avenue with the big median, that was designed to be the road that took us up to the Capitol. And the subdivision around MSU today is still called the Capitol Hill Edition. But we got the college instead. Another example of, indirectly, Uncle Sam to the rescue. Remember, Fort Ellis, government money, saved Bozeman. The Crow Agency, a good source of government money, trickling down into the local economy. And now you got the land grant college. Hallelujah, brother. Story played a huge role, as I say, in trying to get the capital, but more than that, in helping to make sure that the university or the college would come to Bozeman. Miles City wanted it, but the legislature decided Bozeman, its altitude was closer to the average altitude for the whole state. So that's true. That's why. That was one reason. That and Nelson Story and some other promoters. Fast forward a little bit to the Panic of 1893. Nelson Story has his bank in Bozeman. He sits down with the board of directors in the mid-1890s. Several banks are closing in Bozeman. Banks are closing all over the country in the wake of the panic. Nelson Story says, I'm not going to, we don't have to close this bank. By now, he and Ellen, I'll talk more about that in a minute, he and Ellen had a winter home in Los Angeles. And they were getting ready in January to go to Los Angeles to get out of the cold. Story told them, board of directors, if anybody wants to buy the bank's bonds, don't sell them. I want first crack. He leaves town. Somebody makes an offer to buy the bonds. Board of directors sells them. Story gets back in April and finds out. Convenes a meeting of the board, matter in hell, and says, I'm going to close the bank. And that was it. Dr. Foster, Henry Foster, who was a member of the board, was overheard saying at the end of the meeting, somebody ought to take Nelson Story out and hang him. Well, he wasn't being serious, but Story heard about it. Story, a day or two later, confronted him on a Bozeman street and proceeded to beat the heck out of Dr. Foster with his walking cane. Dr. Foster threatened a lawsuit. Nelson Story gave him $20,000 to forget the whole thing. Foster agreed. Foster took the 20 grand and built Bozeman's first hospital. That's how Bozeman got its first hospital, is because Nelson Story beat the heck out of some guy on Main Street. A few years prior to that, Nelson Story built the Story Mansion, which is no longer standing. A lot of people, for some reason in Bozeman, want to think that the SAE house on South Wilson is, no, it's not. That's not the Story Mansion. Story Mansion, if it were still standing, was right across the street from Bamboo Garden, there by the Wilson School. But he built this, he imported stone workings, he had woodworkers from Boston out here to do the woodworking on it. Casado stone, marble from Minnesota. He spared no expense. He didn't have to. He had more money than he knew what to do with. Built this mansion. The bricks for the mansion were dipped in stale beer to preserve their color. I don't know what it is about stale beer that preserves color. But when I first read that, it scared the heck out of me about considering what I drank when I was in college. But I'm still standing, so I guess it's all right anyhow. The mansion, he constructed that mansion, finished 1886, 1887. As I alluded to, he also had a winter home in Los Angeles, in the Adams district of Los Angeles. It's near the USC campus. Back in those days, it was for the Blue Bloods. It was for the Huey Palooey. Today, it's close to a pretty rough neighborhood, but he had a mansion down there. as did a lot of other Montanans, especially wealthy cattlemen and their families who could afford it. So, the Story family was among those who were the first snowbirds. They would come home, their descriptions of the rose festivals and the rose parades and the flower celebrations in California gave somebody the idea, and it evolved in 1906 into Sweet Pea, copying what happened in it wasn't just Nelson's story, don't misunderstand. There were a lot of snowbirds who told him about these flower festivals. But the idea with that in the old days was, yeah, we'll have a flower festival, get people to come to Bozeman, spend all kinds of money over the weekend, see what we can do, and then Monday, go home. And that's how it first started. Story in Los Angeles wisely bought a lot of real estate along Spring Street, along Broadway, the heart of downtown Los Angeles. Later on, fast forward just a little bit into the early 1900s, his son Walter, his youngest son, would build on one of these properties that Nelson bought and gave to him. He would build one of Los Angeles's first skyscrapers. This was in 1910, 1911. It's still there. If you're at the corner of 6th and Broadway in downtown LA, it's the Walter P. Story building. It's from the Story family. He also had a lot of other properties that eventually he doled out to his kids. But that's where he really made a ton of dough. That's where he was really able to set up his family to a tremendous life of comfort. Had a short fuse. Intimated at that with what happened with Dr. Foster. Had a lot of running fights with Joe Lindley when he rerouted Bozeman Creek because he had the water rights to the mill. Bozeman Creek ran right through Joe's property. Story built a dam on his property to get the water into Mill Ditch to get to his place. Now that rubbed Lindley the wrong way. And then worse than that, Lindley owned several joy houses or hotels for single girls down by the Bozeman Hotel. And Nelson's Story foreclosed on him. That ticked off Joe Lindley. Sent a lot of nasty letters to Story. They had arguments on Main Street. One time Nelson pulled out his Navy Colt pistol and hit Joe Lindley right between the eyes. He used to call that pistol his Navy Colt. After he did that, he referred to it as my Lindleyizer. Okay? He once chased Joe across the street through Phillips bookstore, couldn't catch him. But they had this running feud forever, almost all the way up until Joe Lindley died. Strangely, later, Joe's widow gave a bunch of land to the city, and they turned that into Lindley Park. And then in the 1980s, somebody decides to erect a statue of Nelson's Story on his horse. Guess where they put it? Lindley Park. Poor Joe, he's still doing this in his grave. Yeah? But yeah, Nelson's Story, a short fuse. Unfortunately, his family also felt his temper physically and verbally. That included his wife and his sons. He had 3 sons and 1 daughter. As a matter of fact, one time, his 2 oldest sons, Nelson Jr. and Thomas Byron, Nelson Jr. was known as Bud, Thomas Byron was known as Bine. He told them at the mansion, get on your horses, go out to the Northside Ranch. I got that mule out there, I want it here. Go get the mule, bring it back, but don't rope the mule. Okay, so they go out, they get the mule, they come back. For some reason, Bud just couldn't resist lassoing it, and he does, and he catches the mule. The mule breaks away and trots on into the yard, and there's their dad. I thought I told you boys not to rope that mule. Bud says, well, shut up. And the next one of you that says anything, I'm gonna knock him off his damn horse. And Bine, he he kind of lived dangerously a little bit. He couldn't help himself. He says, well, we can rope that mule better than you can. Before he finished his sentence, Nelson had picked up a brick, threw it at him, Bine ducked, brick went over his head, Bine jumped off the horse and ran for downtown with his dad chasing him down Main Street. Nelson was old enough then he couldn't chase him for too long. Bine managed to get away. Story dabbled a little bit in politics. He was mentioned as a candidate for the U.S. Senate in the 1890s. He was even put on the ballot. In those days, it was the state Senate that chose the U.S. Senator. Well, obviously, he didn't get it. Caused a little bit of controversy in the press with him in there, but he did get some votes. It took a while, but he was eventually eliminated. He was a silver Republican. The silver movement in the late 19th century, it was believed, it was maintained that coinage at the old ratio of 16:1, silver to gold, would be a benefit to farmers and ranchers. Story, with his mill operation, agreed. He campaigned quite heavily, and he came over to Livingston to bang the drum quite a bit for the silver coinage plan. He was a silver Republican. It was kind of a division in the Republican Party back then. William Jennings Bryan came to Bozeman to talk about that, and it was Nelson Story who helped to arrange it, set it up, and he became a fairly good friend of William Jennings Bryan as a result. Nelson Story, well, I should say Ellen, passed away in 1924. Story's kids, several months later, decided to take him to Los Angeles. They thought he could get better care there. There was a wing for retired people in the Angeles Hospital. His daughter, Rose, asked him, how do you like it here? He says, it's okay, but there's a lot of old people here. He was 86, which in those days, you made it to 80. Holy cow, you were doing good. He died there in 1926. Later on, in the 1930s, the Story Mansion was torn down. And what happened basically was Walter, his home was permanently in Los Angeles. He was a big shot with the California National Guard and the U.S. Army. The California National Guard's official research library is the Walter P. Story Library to this day. So he was ensconced in Los Angeles. So was Rose and her husband in Los Angeles. Bud died relatively young at the age of 58. His wife had been killed in a car crash. Don't want to give too much away, do I? Nobody will buy. Oh, no, never mind. That left Thomas Byron and his wife, Kate. Now, they had built the house that's on Wilson in 1910, 1911, but he lost it 10 years later when he lost his shirt in the wool business. After World War I, wool took a serious nosedive. He was wiped out. So, for a while, he and his wife lived in the mansion. They couldn't afford to pay the taxes on it. And it so happened with the school, Wilson School there, the Works Progress Administration during the Depression said, we'll build an addition on your school. We'll pay workers, we'll put up the money for it. That was a big... The Stories, Bine sold the mansion to the school district in exchange for them paying the taxes, bringing that up to snuff. And then the school board says, well, in order to make this addition work, you know, that mansion, it's going to block valuable sunlight during the school year. Wait a minute. The mansion is north of the school. The sun goes this way to the south, but nobody really contested it too much. Nobody in the community, there was no banging the drum to try to save the mansion. It was the Depression. People were more worried about keeping their own property out of tax foreclosure. And again, the Story kids had pretty much lost interest. So it was sold, and it was torn down to make room for the school extension. I know that some of the Story family today in this area, they still have bits and pieces from the mansion. The Story family plot in Sunset Hills, the real fancy pillars, those came from the mansion. So it's a shame it was taken down, but like so many other cattle barons, so many other capitalists of the American West, Nelson Story was one of those who rewarded himself and his family with that fancy mansion. So, anyway, that's an overview in about 57 minutes. There is a lot more, you know, everybody's got a little capitalist in them, you know, got to do it. I suppose now there might be some things didn't cover, or if anybody has any questions. Yes, sir. Oh, you got the microphone. Okay.
Two things. Maybe you could touch briefly on Malcolm, who many of us here may remember. And also, wasn't there a oil factor in the Story family? Any connections with the oil industry?
He had some investments, minor ones in Texas. I do know, and New Mexico, but it was quickly given to his kids. That could have been the tie-in. Beyond that, I'm really not 100% certain. Didn't find anything on that. But yeah, Malcolm, definitely one of Bozeman's characters, to say the least. I did get to meet him and talk to him one time when I was working for a title company, inspecting property on South Wilson, and he happened to be there, and he pointed out the SAE house that he was raised there, grew up there, and told me a lot about his grandfather and his grandmother Ellen, for whom the Ellen Theater obviously is named. But yeah, Malcolm was quite the character, quite the guy. Really liked him a lot. And actually it was Malcolm, he was responsible for having a lot of the letters and notes of the family transcribed, typed out, and preserved. And he gave them to the History Museum over there, a lot of records, and they proved to really, really be important. So his love for history indirectly is the reason we're here tonight.
Other questions?
Yeah, can you tell us about the connection between the stories in Park County and the what the family connection is?
Let's see. I know Martha Drysdale is here tonight. She could probably tell it a lot better than I can. But my understanding is with Malcolm, Pete was his adopted son. That's what I understand. And so, you know, Pete's story down by Immigrant, not, you know, pretty close to where the, at one time, Story moved his ranch, his cattle ranch down there. So it looks like he's tied, the stories here are tied to the stories via Malcolm and his dad, Bine Story. But that's what I've been told, that's my understanding, and there might even be somebody here who can tell me better. But Malcolm adopted Pete, and then Pete, as you know, quite influential around here in the legislature, so forth and so on. Their place, probably been by their place down there. My wife and I got to go into their shed and see some of the things they have. They have the tin box that Nelson used to take his gold back east. They have saddles that belong to Nelson and Bud and Bine. They have horse carriages used by Ellen. Really cool stuff. Really nice stuff. So they do have strong ties to the Story family, you bet.
Any other comments or questions?
How long did you research this?
What?
I'm
Male story?
I'm sorry?
Male?
Story,
Mayo.
Mayo, M-A-Y-O.
Oh, yes, Mayo Story, daughter of Bud and Kate. Oh, no, I'm sorry, not Kate, Etha, for whom they might name that hotel that they're building, the Etha. She was a St. Louis socialite, Etha. Bud met her when he was going to business school in St. Louis. She came from a Confederate family. Her dad, a veteran Confederate officer. She was smitten by this guy from the cattle ranges of Montana, and they got married in St. Louis, and he brought her up here. But Mayo, was one of their daughters. That's correct. And, can't think of the names, but there are some descendants from that end of the family that live around the Bozeman area. Okay, there was another question.
I just wonder how long your research was.
I started as a hobby in 1994. I couldn't really get to it until, again, it was a hobby, doing it off the back of my hand. And then about 15 or 20 years later, I was able to really hone in on it and concentrate on it. So it was kind of a part of me for about 21, 22 years.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah,
Wow.
thanks.
Well, thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you very much.